I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside. It's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off-road. The guy managed the group. He was like, what are you doing in this beautiful car? I'm like, I'm going off-road. He's like, are you sure? Because you can use one of ours. And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability, as well as its robust interior, are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at landroverusa.com/Defender.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show on the Choose Yourself Network. Today on the James Altucher Show.
In America, citizens have to think about their place in history. That your place in history is not determined for you by where you're born or who your parents are, but that you make your own place in history as an American. So if you write speeches, especially for a president, your goal is not to become an expert on every subject. Your goal is to become somebody who sort of could talk about it for 5 minutes. And if you learn too much, sometimes you lose sight of what's interesting.
I want to also learn how to be a speechwriter out of this podcast.
Okay, yeah. By the end of our time together, you'll be all set with your speechwriting license. If you look at a lot of good speeches, they're either very specific personal details or big, meaningful values. One of my favorite speeches is the speech that Martin Luther King delivered the night before he was shot. He talks about surviving an assassination attempt. A woman, a deranged woman, stabbed him with a letter opener. It almost got to his heart. Doctors told him that if he had sneezed, he would have died. This got out in the press, and he got a letter from a 9-year-old white girl who said, I just wanted to let you know I'm glad you didn't sneeze. And then he goes on this long run where he prefaces everything with saying, I too am glad I didn't sneeze, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been able to tell you all about a dream that I had. And so he's connecting this very, very meaningless moment, a sneeze, with these incredibly important national events.
I am really happy about our brand new sponsor. I really am a big believer in what they do. Lulu. Lulu is more than just a free self-publishing company. It provides low-cost, high-quality, print-on-demand services that make it easy for you to tell your story. Plus, Lulu's print network makes your books available within days and deliverable around the world. No wonder Lulu is the world's largest indie bookstore. So, share your knowledge. Just go to Lulu, that's LULU.com, and use the offer code JAMES20 for 20% off your purchases of any print book on the site, or write your own book and get 20% off your first proof copy. I've got David Litt. I think you've had kind of my dream youth. We'll start from the end. You wrote for a young man named President Obama. You were a speechwriter for him. That's what this book is about. It's called Thanks, Obama. My Hopi Changey White House Years by David Litt, a speechwriter's memoir. You have like 2 subtitles. I always hate subtitles.
I know. Well, it was important, I think, for my publisher. They were like, you need to include that you were a speechwriter, because otherwise people are going to be like, why did you write this book?
Right, it's
who
not like
are
your
you?
Secretary of State.
Exactly. Nobody's going to be like, oh, David Litt. There is a David Litt who created The King of Queens. So in as much as anybody would think, oh, David Litt, they'd be like, oh, that guy I saw from the credits from The King of Queens, who's not me, and also didn't write for Obama. And so I will say, to my publisher's credit, one of the concerns, I got a 1-star review on Amazon, and the rating said, this is a misleading book. Thanks Obama makes it seem like it's a collection of memes. The Thanks Obama memes, where you do something silly and say, thanks Obama.
Well, you're going to have to deal with a lot of 1-star reviews. You're
Right.
going to get half the country is going to give you 1-star reviews, and half the country is going to give you 3 to 5-star reviews.
That's right. And that's with any political book. That's why I thought I've gotten some of those that were like, Obama sucks, 1 star, fine. But the one that was like, this is a very disappointing meme collection, I particularly enjoyed that. So at least, I could say or think to myself, well, it has memoir on the cover. So it's nice. I can alternate which subtitle I use.
So I've always actually had this secret desire to be a speechwriter. Like years ago, I had another political person, I won't mention his name now, on the podcast, and I said literally, can I just write 1 speech for you? 'Cause
Yeah.
I just wanted to try it as an exercise, because it does seem like a difficult skill, and we'll get into it.
What did that person say?
Sure, I'll put in a word for you. You want to be hired by the person? Because this person was working for a political person.
Oh, I see.
And he says, you want to be hired as their like head speechwriter? Because that had been a job he had been offered.
I see.
And I'm like, no, I just want to write 1 speech.
Yeah, that's usually, I don't know. I feel like that's generally not how that works.
Yeah, no,
but
nothing
it's funny. Speechwriting, I guess, not unlike comedy, is the kind of job that anybody's like, can I kibitz in that for like, if I was talking about you about my experience as like a fighter pilot, you would be like, just one flight. Can I go,
Right.
let me just take it for a spin. But it is true. It's one of the, I think, the appealing things about speechwriting is that it's accessible, that there's no, I don't have any like particular, license as a speechwriter that anyone else doesn't have. But it is one of those things where, like, in the comedy world, everybody who's been funny at a dinner party wants to tell a comedian how to do their job. It is sort of similar in speechwriting. Anyone who's like yelled at the TV when the president's spoken is like, oh, I could do that.
Well, and just to be clear, you're mentioning, I don't want to make people think that this comedy thing is out of context, because then maybe they'll think, oh, to be a speechwriter you have to, all the speeches jokes. Just to be clear, we were talking about comedy right beforehand, because as a 15-year-old, you used to do stand-up at a comedy club that I now perform at, Stand Up New York on the Upper West Side. So that was just an odd little coincidence. We had never met before or anything.
Yeah, and I guess the weird thing looking back on it was that I was like, oh yeah, that was 16 years ago. So like more time has passed between now and then than between like my birth and when I did stand-up at Stand Up New York. But yeah, I used to go on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and like bringer shows. So
Yeah.
I'd rope all of my friends in like 9th or 10th grade, and they'd all pay $20, and we'd sit, no one could drink, and we'd sit there, and I'd do my 5 minutes that they had seen 8 times by that point, but they were very nice about it. And then we'd go, I don't know, like walk through the park at night or whatever it was that we did, because we weren't really that rebellious, but that was like going through Central Park at night was a big deal.
So just like we were talking about all the different skills involved with comedy before the podcast started, so skipping that for a second, would you say one thing that I pointed out is that there's a lot more, and as you just started pointing, there's a lot more skills involved in something like comedy than people realize. It's not like just being funny. Would you say for speechwriting, there's just as many or more? You were at the peak. You were the king of the hill. You're writing for the president of the United States. So your speeches were going to be widely read. As you saw, every word was going to be pieced apart by every country and government around the world. So would you say at that level, are there just as many skills and nuances to learn as any other difficult skill, like, say, flying a fighter jet?
Well, I've never flown a fighter jet, but I think that the difference between the stand-up comedy analogy and speechwriting, there is a difference between being like the person on stage, and having it all be on you. So one of the things I write about in the book, because I wasn't really the king of the hill, even in the speechwriting sense. I started as kind of the lowest level speechwriter at the White House. And by the time I left, I was kind of on the junior level of the senior staff, which meant I still ran everything by my boss, the chief speechwriter, but had been there for a little longer. For me, it is definitely true that the things about writing speeches for a president that are most challenging are not the things you would think. So lots of people who are great speechwriters sometimes wouldn't do as well in the White House because there's all these competing pressures. You mentioned one of them, the fact that there's an industry of people whose job it is to pick your words or the president's words apart, to take them out of context. So sometimes, if you have a writer who really is great at writing big, grand, glowing sentences, but can't check them to make sure that they're even taken out of context, not going to say something other than what you meant, that might be a skill that makes it harder to be a speechwriter for a president than for somebody else. I will say, the speechwriting in the White House, at least in the Obama White House, like a lot of dream jobs, the number of people who were more than capable of doing it versus the number of spots available was pretty skewed. So, I tried to make it clear that I loved writing speeches for President Obama. I think I was very lucky, but it was not, a matter of only these 8 people could do this job. It was really a matter of, there's a few dozen, maybe 100 speechwriters in Washington who have that kind of talent, and then you hope you get lucky and get a shot. And I did.
I like you could talk about a bunch of different nuances. I kind of bookmarked it, a couple places. So in one speech you wrote, your boss at the time kind of rewrote, and you were astonished by the amounts of rewrites. And you specifically say the way he connected America's stories and America's story, self-interest and the national interest in a way you had not. So that strikes me as a particular skill and nuance that a presidential speechwriter and even a lower political figure speechwriter needs to have. So what's that skill? Well, and then I kind of want to get into how you got this career and great job and so on. So I want to also learn how to be a speechwriter out of this podcast.
Okay, yeah. By the end of our time together, you'll be all set with your speechwriting license. I think that the thing you were talking about, I wrote a speech. This was about infrastructure finance, and I made the mistake of learning a little too much about it without putting it in context. So if you write speeches, especially for a president, your goal is not to become an expert on every subject. You work with experts on every subject. Your goal is to become somebody who sort of could talk about it for 5 minutes. And if you learn too much, sometimes you lose sight of what's interesting. One way to think about it is, I forget who coined the phrase, but there's this concept of ladders of meaning. So at the very bottom of the ladder is very basic details, and at the very top of the ladder is big values.
So ladders of meaning, is this, tell me what you mean, like where did that come from?
I actually don't remember. A former boss of mine, Vinca LaFleur, used to talk about it, because she would say, if you look at a lot of good speeches, everything exists on either the lowest or the highest rungs. They're either very specific personal details or big, meaningful values. So, one of my favorite speeches is the speech that Martin Luther King delivered the night before he was shot. And he talks about surviving an assassination attempt where a deranged woman, stabbed him with a letter opener. And he says, it almost got to his heart, and doctors told him that if he had sneezed, he would have died. And and this got out in the press, and he got a letter from, I think it was a 9-year-old white girl who said, I just wanted to let you know, I'm glad you didn't sneeze. And then he goes on this long run where he's talking about all the progress that the civil rights movement has made since that time. But he prefaces everything with saying, I too am glad I didn't sneeze, because if I hadn't sneezed, or if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have seen. And then he describes these big civil rights victories, or he says, if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been able to tell you all about a dream that I had. And so he's connecting this very, very meaningless moment, a sneeze, with these incredibly important national events. And so on there's a speech about infrastructure finance that I was writing about. It's not going to be like that.
Break that one down a little bit, like to connect that to this ladders of meaning.
So in other words, he's talking about either the lowest rung, these very mundane, everyday things, sneezing.
But also that sneezing is related to a super high stakes thing.
Exactly.
Which is his, he lives.
Right.
So do you connect those kind of basic details to something high stakes?
Right. So so it's not just high stakes, but that notion of the sort of mundane parts of our existence with the much more kind of big picture spiritual parts of our existence, or the values that we care about. So he's connecting the sneeze, which is him saying, I'm glad I lived, but he goes even more mundane than that. He finds a way to make it even more trivial, and we all know what he's talking about.
I see. So, but that itself seems like an important technique, like how you connect. He doesn't just say, "I'm glad I lived." He doesn't just say, "I'm glad I'm alive."
Right.
He connects life to sneezing. So why is that important?
Well, that's a good question. Because one of the things I will say is that as a speechwriter, I almost never spent time analyzing speeches in this way. It's fun to do it right now. And so, but I can't say like my theory of it is, but my sort of off the cuff guess is that one of the things that he's doing is taking a concept, living, and turning it into something tangible, sneezing, right? And,
that we do every day.
Right, that we do every day, that also there's a verb associated with it that's active, right? So, you're living, I'm living while we record this podcast. It would be weird if we weren't.
It's also a little funny.
It's a little funny, and it's a little surprising. But I think the beauty of it is finding that detail. So I think about in President Obama's speeches, and I didn't write this one, but I remember, you could say X number of small businesses have, opened since I became president, something like that. But, he talked instead about a business owner kind of hanging that open for business sign on their door. That's not a huge difference in terms of what he's saying, but it's an image you can put in your head, right? So we can imagine someone sneezing. We can imagine the moment that store owner hangs that sign out in front, and what that looks like.
Like opening a business, and I'm sorry if I interrupt.
No, please.
Opening a business is like this abstract term. It's almost like a statistical, like what's the business statistics of last year, as opposed to like we can all picture almost that 1920s, I'm going to put my sign up with the calligraphy on it. It's on the door.
Exactly.
And so we feel this visceral American dream feel from that visual imagery.
Right. Imagery, I think, is exactly right. You have an image in your head. I think one thing, and I say this in the book, that if I learned from writing for a long time, it's that people hate words and love pictures. And so if you can't give them pictures, the best you can do is kind of give them words that create pictures. And so I think that that image of this man sneezing, and obviously it's just connected to, it's not just a sneeze, but that you can picture it. And then you go to these things you can't picture, but still matter, right? This idea of these incredibly important moments in American history and civil rights history that are harder to picture in that way because they're not tangible objects. They're not active verbs like a sneeze, like sneezing is, but the ability to connect those two things. And speeches like the one I wrote, that the draft I wrote that got rewritten and deservedly so, are speeches that tend to live in the middle. So they're not about relatable details and they're not about transcendent values. They're kind of stuck in the middle somewhere. In my case, it was sort of about like advances in dredging technology or, the financing mechanisms in public-private partnerships.
So tell me what happened. So you wrote that speech. What did you do wrong, and what did he fix?
So that's what I did wrong was essentially it was a speech that had a lot of detail about something that ultimately didn't matter that much for the speech. In other words, the audience either already knew about infrastructure and didn't care, or they cared but they didn't need to hear it again, or they didn't care and they weren't going to care just because the president said it.
Because infrastructure is like this abstract word too, like
right.
Infrastructure. What does it even mean? So again, it seems like you have to. What would be like a way you would think about it now? Like, would you say, well, this bridge collapsed in Minnesota, and so is, doesn't have a father. I wish she did, or I don't know.
That's part. I mean, that always trying to think about how to turn big sort of policy words into actual things that we can relate to does matter. What's interesting is those things also tend to become cliches over time. So like you'll hear a lot of politicians talk about crumbling roads and bridges, or crumbling schools. And these are legitimate problems in America. And the first time someone said that, you could picture it in your head and it meant something. And now probably we've heard that so many times from politicians, it's become shorthand and it no longer is an image. Now it's just kind of a concept again. So you're always trying to update to stay true to what you believed last week and the week before, but trying to update it so that there's enough surprise, enough, enough kind of newness to the phrase that it lets you create that image in your head. So going back to this speech, that's what my boss, Cody, did. And also part of it was just making it simple and about the big picture. So, the line I used that he wrote in that speech that the president delivered was, there's work that needs to be done. There are workers who are ready to do it. That's just very straightforward. And it also is broad. It's about all of America. And that's a distinction between writing for presidents and writing for almost anyone else.
What was that distinction? I don't understand.
So, for example, when I was writing for the senior staff at the White House, if somebody was giving a speech to, I'm just making this up, if someone was giving a speech to a convention of plumbers, they could talk about plumbing and exclusively plumbing for the 20 minutes that they had. And that's fine because nobody who is in the non-plumbing community is going to be watching that speech. Maybe a few people, but not a lot. For the president, every speech is a speech about America. I mean, that's the way I put it in my book, because the audience is not just the construction workers in Miami who are building this tunnel that he was there to visit. It's also the people watching on TV. It's the national reporters who are trying to figure out what headline to write and how this event fits into everything else that's going on in the country, both politically and actually. And so that ends up being more challenging in some ways, but also more exciting in some ways, because you get to be kind of at the top of that ladder of meaning more often. And again, this is not like how I thought about it at the time. At the time, I was like, well, shoot, I have a week to do this thing, and how do I just get it done as quickly as I can, as well as I can? So one of the reasons I wrote the book in some ways was that working at the White House, you can't really reflect on your experience. You don't have time. And I wanted to be able to go back and try to think through what had happened.
So wait, so with this one speech in particular that got rewritten, what's like a bad phrase that you thought was good, but then he smashed it, and then how did he replace it?
So I don't even remember. The bad phrases were bad because they were so unmemorable. I don't actually remember all of the, I just remember that it was a lot of explanation, right? It was, imagine going to see a movie and it's just a movie with tons of exposition in it.
Right, so
it felt like that.
Instead of a movie about like how hyperdrive works, you get Star Wars.
Right. So yeah, exactly. Like imagine if, like Han and Chewie, who spent a solid 20 minutes explaining the, like why their hyperdrive repairs, were a success when others have tried similar repairs and come up short. That's not an interesting movie, and it's also not what the movie's about, right? That's the other point, is like it's a movie about characters. It's a movie, and now we're just going to talk about Star Wars for another 30 minutes. But you know what I mean? It's a movie where the point of the movie is not the intricacies of the hyperdrive. The point is like, what are these characters doing, and what's their journey that they're on? And so that's the point that I was making about kind of America's story and the stories of Americans is thinking about how do each of us fit into this national story. And the truth is, detail is important for that, but not every detail is important for that.
So let's kind of, just so I want to understand a little more, let's say you're writing for a presidential candidate right now, and let's just forget about the current political environment, because it's easy to kind of, the America is so divided in half. Let's just take a quote unquote normal election.
Sure.
Because the next election probably won't be normal either.
No, it will not.
Maybe no other election ever again will be normal.
That's right.
But let's say you were making a kind of presidential style speech right now. What would you say? Or let's say you were Donald Trump and you were actually writing a speech about something. What would you say?
Well, this is the only thing. So I don't think you can take it out of the context of the speaker. Mm-hmm. So in other words, what Trump would say about the United States, I mean, what he is saying is very specific to Trump and the way that he sees the world. What Obama said about the United States and about his role as president was specific to the way he sees the world. So I think it is...
So do an Obama-style speech about some issue right now.
Well, I don't know that it's. I don't know that it's. Yeah, exactly. Just like
this is a homework assignment. Do it right now.
Do a speech.
You had a week to do it for Obama.
Yeah, exactly.
But
This is the reason
podcast.
we wrote them and worked with people, including the president. I think that's the one of the things that I think is important about speech writing is it's not that I could sort of sit down and say, all right, well, we'll just do an Obama speech about this, because you do need to have a sense of what is it that the president thinks about this issue. You can kind of guess, but I would be less good at guessing now than I was a year and a half ago, because I'm not reading everything that he says, and he doesn't speak as frequently as he did when he was president.
Okay, so let's go through process. So like, let's say it's affordable health care. Obviously, you know how he feels about that. What would be the next step in your process?
Yeah. Well, so this is a good way of thinking about it. So yeah, you're talking about healthcare. One of the things that we would be doing as a speechwriting team is thinking about how do we get this out of the Washington debate, right? What's really at stake here? Another way of thinking about it is like, why is this important to the audience? So, for example, it could be important for a number of reasons. It could be important because some people have pre-existing conditions and could see their health insurance taken away if the price of healthcare goes way up for people with those conditions. Another example, you could have family members who are in that situation. You could be the kind of person who is totally healthy, but if you got in a car accident or you got sick or you lost your job, suddenly you're not able to get the care you need, or you have to choose between, do I foreclose on my house, do I go bankrupt, or do I pay my medical bills?
So all these are extremely emotional, and so you're basically trying to touch the emotions first before you touch the intellectual rationalization.
Yeah, I think the intellectual part of it matters, but it's not the reason that the sort of central question of why are we talking about this and not something else is rarely answered purely in intellectual terms, right? And by the way, with healthcare, it can also be, those are some extreme examples. It can also just be somebody who says, you know what, I don't want to be paying thousands of dollars more every single year for health insurance, especially when in other countries they manage to do this just fine and it doesn't cost people as much. So I want to spend that money on like vacation, or I want to spend that money on, sending my kid to college, or any of the other things that you could spend that money that instead is going toward healthcare. It's like it's almost like paying an extra tax just because we live in the American healthcare system, not in another country's healthcare system.
Well, I like this idea of the structure of the Martin Luther King speech, where he attaches this high-stakes story of his assassination attempt with a 9-year-old girl's letter, and then bringing that all into like one word, sneezing, and then using sneezing, almost like triggering this, using that weird word, it's like a funny word, to trigger like a huge emotional response over every massive achievement in civil rights. And so did you ever find yourself kind of like that's such a beautiful structure, and I like the way you bring that speech up. Did you ever find yourself kind of taking a structure like that and successfully applying it to Obama?
I don't think it's as one-to-one. It's not like saying, okay, well, this was a beautiful speech, so how do we do one of those for President Obama or anybody else? And you'd have to talk, I guess, to some of my colleagues. Maybe they thought about it differently. One thing I will say is a lot of the most kind of poetic speeches that President Obama delivered are not speeches that I wrote, because they were, maybe the sort of beginning of a State of the Union, or especially a speech after a tragedy, or the speech that President Obama delivered in Selma. When Martin Luther King was delivering that speech in Memphis, he was talking about a variety of things. It was not sort of what we would call a message event. I mean, it was a big, weighty, very complicated address on technically on the sanitation workers strike happening there, but more broadly on kind of everything that brought them to this moment, and looking forward. I mean, that speech is also where he talks about the things where it almost sounds prescient, like he knows what's going to happen. Obviously, I don't think he did, but there's he talks about having been to the mountaintop, right? It's kind of the I've been to the mountaintop speech, and that it is kind of looking back and forward. I feel we've reached the limits of my understanding of that speech without having it in front of me, because I don't remember it perfectly.
But still, I like you were able to describe the basic structure, and that's the thing I want to.
Yeah, so I think that if you look at some of President Obama's speeches that were, I think, particularly important. And I say this as sort of an outsider here because I did not write them.
That's fine.
You know,
you were there. Like you're the expert.
Right,
You
well-
wrote the book. You're in front of us.
yeah, exactly. I wrote the book. We'll go with that. No, it's funny because I'm like, am I really? And I'm like, I did write a book, so I guess I'll talk about it. No, look at, for example, the speech he gave on the 50th anniversary of Selma, which I think is just a beautiful speech that Cody Keenan, my boss at the time, and President Obama worked on together. And in that speech, he keeps coming back to this theme of what it means to be a patriot. And he doesn't address it directly, but he's always addressing it obliquely from different angles. And he's talking about the past, but weaving it into debates that we're having now. So when he talks about the way that the marchers at Selma were ridiculed or called communists or called enemies of anti-American or whatever, he's clearly not just talking about the marchers there. He's talking about this broader issue, and he's doing it in an artful way where he never says, "This is what I'm talking about," but there's no mistaking what he's talking about.
What was the artful way?
Well, in other words, so he's always talking about patriotism, but the easy way to write a speech would be to say, "I'm here to talk about patriotism." Webster's dictionary defines patriotism as, that's kind of the stereotype of that style of speech, but you still will hear speeches where somebody sort of very clearly says, here's the message of the speech, right? I mean, we all sort of remember George H.W. Bush having his message, I care speech that he delivered, and saying that out loud. And what was funny about that was that it was kind of like, this is supposed to be subtext, but a lot of speakers go straight to text because that gives you the least possibility of being misinterpreted. And also because it's simple. I mean, when you don't have 50 minutes, you have 15 minutes, you got to be very straightforward. But sometimes some of these speeches you look at, and I do think they were more artful in that way, where it didn't leave you wondering what was going on, but there was never that point where it said, this is the thesis of my speech.
So with the someone, I don't know that speech. Did he say so many years ago today, there was this, there were the marchers in Selma, those were patriots. And then there's this event, those were patriots.
I think it was even more subtle than that. I my phone's charging over in the corner there, so I don't have it in front of me and I can't look up the language exactly. And I don't feel...
Excuses
I know, right?
with you all the time.
Yeah, all the time. Well, and I will say, I feel like, where, for example, I'm very comfortable talking about the Correspondents dinners with some authority because I worked on the joke speeches,
we'll get to.
But, for something like that, I do think that I think I'd have to look at it carefully again because I don't remember the process because I wasn't part of the process. I think that if you look at that speech from my recollection of it, he does sort of say, here's what happened, but it's not so much he's doing something that also you can do with a joke, where it's a puzzle, but you're letting the audience solve the puzzle, but they all agree on the solution. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's like you're letting people come to their own conclusions, but you're also steering them in a way where they're going to reach the conclusion that you hope they will reach.
Which is that he describes a broad event. There was a problem, people marched. So and then the solution is these are the patriots.
That's some of it, and I think also this notion of what are we doing here today? Going back to what we were talking about with every speech, why is this important? What are we remembering when we remember, this sort of moment in civil rights history and American history 50 years ago? Why does it matter? And one of the reasons it matters, I think he was saying, is that we shouldn't remember this as just being something that people marched across a bridge and everybody said, "Oh, this is great, we love this." It was very controversial and in some ways unpopular at the time. And we should remember that in addition to remembering the sort of triumph of the fact that we now look back on it and say they were on the right side of history. It doesn't always feel that, it isn't always that obvious at the time to everybody.
Let's stop to take a quick break. We'll be right back. You're busy and your time is valuable, so you need to get things done quickly, efficiently, and at a competitive price. Choose Lulu. Lulu is more than just a free self-publishing company. They are also your business partner. create product guides, manuals, and brand books on Lulu's easy-to-use platform. Lulu's low-cost, high-quality print-on-demand services allow you to buy the quantities you need and when you need them. Plus, Lulu's print network makes your books available within days and deliverable around the world. And better yet, it is a certified B Corporation and offers the largest revenue splits in the industry. Share your knowledge and become an authority in your field by publishing with Lulu. Let your book be your new business card. So, tell your story. Just go to Lulu, LULU.com, and use the offer code JAMES20 for 20% off your purchase of any print book on the site, or write your own and get 20% off your first proof copy. That's Lulu.com, offer code JAMES20. So in terms of this ladder of meaning, it's not necessarily like on the ladder of meaning, patriotism might be number 2. That specific on the ladder, that specific idea about civil rights might be number 3. But number 1 might be the fact that a true patriot or hero or American might be someone who is willing to take a stand for something deeply unpopular at the time.
I think
that might be the top of the ladder of meaning.
I think that's part of it, but I think that it's not so much ranking like this is the important thing, this is the second most important, but more to say, on one hand, you're talking about specifics, right? I know in kind of retelling that story, the speech that Cody wrote includes John Lewis as a 26-year-old kind of getting his backpack with everything you need for a night in prison, right? So I remember that image of the backpack.
And yeah, because then that's something, again, like the sneeze that could be carried forward. Do you have your backpack?
Well, right. So that's, I don't think he did in that case, but yeah, for sure. That is like that idea of playing with something that is both real and metaphorical. But the important thing is that my guess is that a day from now, when you think about our conversation, you probably won't remember most of what I've said, but you probably will remember a backpack. You'll remember that image. And you'll probably remember the concept of patriotism. And so, similarly, just describing marchers,
the top
right?
and the bottom.
Exactly. So, rather than saying, the history of segregation is, and kind of going through it in a clinical way, which would be sort of in the middle, saying, making this about these big things and these small things. And I think if you can...
And interweaving.
Right. Always kind of bouncing between the two, and showing the connections between the two. And I think that, again, it's not, I never sat down at my computer and said, all right, where's, how's my ladder of meaning doing? And where's, what are my details and what are my big values? But I do think you try to get in that habit. And the other piece of it is that question of why does this matter? That was a question I would ask. It's sort of like the president of the United States could be talking about anything today. Why is he talking about this? And it's one thing, you look at Trump, not to get too political, but if you look at what he chooses to talk about, it seems fairly random, right? And it's one of the things that I think unsettles people about him is that I'm not sure that he knows the answer to the question of like, why am I talking about this today?
So it's almost like you're saying Obama had maybe an instinct for what his overall media message would be during a particular period in time. Like, I'm going to always make sure I'm going to stick to these points for some time.
I'd go beyond that. I'd say one of the things I admire about him as a president is that he had a sense for what deserved his limited attention because he only had so much time in the day, how to prioritize. So that not just what do we prioritize with the message, but also what do we prioritize with the actual things we're doing, and how do we do both of those in a way that makes the most sense? Because if you're the president of the United States, you have so many things coming at you every day, and most of them are important. Even the distractions are important. I think
like
about...
What?
So, you could think about what's going on right now in the world, right? So this week, we're talking about Iran, North Korea, a variety of, wildfires in California. Puerto Rico still doesn't have power. And what is President Trump doing? He's largely talking about the NFL. And to some extent trying to make it so that people have a harder time buying health insurance on the Obamacare markets. I would argue that is probably not where he should be spending his time. Those are big issues. One is a large cultural issue. The other is a real important policy issue. But with all the other stuff going on in the world, is this really what we want to be dealing with? I mean, he's tweeting about whether NBC should lose its license. Not that they have a license exactly in the first place, but, that's what is occupying his attention in that moment.
It's funny how he doesn't realize, and again, I don't mean to get political at all. I'm really interested in kind of the mechanics of speech writing. But there is this huge but this connection. Nixon wanted to shut down the Washington Post.
Right.
And I don't understand, just a basic knowledge of history would connect the two events.
Yeah, I think that we're. I wish that Trump was sort of in a vacuum and kind of came out of nowhere. But I think this is largely the culmination of a strategy that began with Nixon. That Nixon had the Southern strategy that basically said Democrats are becoming the party of civil rights, so we're going to start to win the Southern states with these kind of dog whistles that indicate, okay, we're standing against the expansion of civil rights. And it worked. And I think there's other things that have helped the Republican Party as well, but I think that was not just a sort of accident of history, that was a strategy. And I think this is the culmination of that strategy, where you have President Trump really speaking primarily to his base that wants to take us back pretty substantially, including like actual, white supremacists and neo-Nazis. I didn't think that we would be talking about that these days, but we are. So
I want to get back to speeches that from way before you were involved, but the ones that kind of inspired you, and I think I bookmarked them somewhere. But you referred to a speech he gave in 2005 when he was kind of just getting started on the national scene. And you made a really interesting point about how he threw it back to the audience, where he mentioned how someone asked him, what makes you qualified to do anything? And I had it bookmarked,
it's
but maybe you could.
The Knox College commencement he gave in 2005. So a reporter, he tells this story about a reporter asking him, Senator Obama, what will be your place in history? And going back to this idea of kind of detail and value, right? Here, do you mind if I grab your copy here? And so he says, right, it's interesting. So then he's talking about that. The reporter, he says, I have not even taken a single vote. I have not introduced one bill, had not even sat down in my desk. And this very earnest reporter raises his hand and says, Senator Obama, what is your place in history? And talking about some of those details, to me, the fact that he, in that speech, includes, I've not even sat down in my desk. That, again, going back to the as concrete as you can make it, and then this big value question. And the combination is what makes it so strange. I haven't even sat at my desk. What is your place in history? And he ends up, sort of saying, I did what you would do talking to the students, which is laugh out loud. But then he turns the question around on his head and he asks the students, and that is the theme of his speech, what will be your place in history? And it's this idea that in America, citizens have to think about their place in history, that your place in history is not determined for you by where you're born or who your parents are, but that you make your own place in history as an American.
So it makes that speech and that technique, and let's just call it a technique for a second, of kind of reversing it. The question's not for me, but it's for everybody. So let's say that's the technique. It reminds me of two things. One reminds me of his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, where he basically said, I'm paraphrasing, of course, because I can't remember anything, but he basically says, this is not my prize, but a prize for, our future, or what we hope to do. So again, he throws it into a bigger scheme, which is that this is for everybody to think about, not for me to think about, or not for me to glory over. So it sort of is not quite self-deprecating, but removes...
it's not self-centered.
Yeah, it's not self-centered, which he makes it better and more accepting for everybody. And I think that's a technique he does throughout many of his speeches. But it also reminds me of another great speechwriter, maybe the best of all time, Ted Sorensen with President Kennedy. That was also a common technique. And I'm sure Obama must have studied Kennedy's speeches. In fact, there was a lot of comparisons when Obama was elected between the two. But, the ask not what your country will do for you, but what you will do for your country. So which uses a very specific kind of alliterative type of technique, plus this idea of throwing it back to everybody.
Well, I think some of it is speech writing, but some of it is also just sort of how do you orient yourself toward the world. So I think that President Obama really did think of this as, obviously he ran for president. He thought he should be the president, but he also thought that the change he was talking about is only going to happen, is not going to happen just because of him. It's going to happen because of things we all do together. And that was a pretty common theme of everything that he was saying. So it's not just a rhetorical device, it's also reflective of who he really was as president and as a person and how he thought about these issues. So again,
that's a good way to put it, because I guess I'm viewing it the way I just said it. It's like I'm viewing it as a technique, and you bring it back to the fact that you're saying it's not just a technique. The technique's coming from who he is.
Right. That the message and the messenger both matter, and that there needs to be, if there's a disconnect between them, the audience would notice. If
Is that true?
I mean, not true every time, but I think generally speaking, that is pretty true. And the audience may not know what's happening, but generally I find that people have a pretty good sense of this is right, or like this is a little off.
So you as a writer, you go back through Obama's speeches, you understand the techniques he's using, but also understand how this connects to who he is, and then you use that information to kind of as a backdrop when you're writing your speeches.
That was some of it. I mean, I would say it's not even so much thinking about here's the techniques that he is using.
I'm just so analytical. Like I think about these things in that way.
Well, and I think that is, it's kind of the difference between doing the work and kind of thinking about the work. Do you know what I mean? That like,
yes, that's actually an important distinction, and most people don't realize that.
Yeah, and so it's not to say that there isn't technique, but to say that it's kind of, it doesn't feel like that when in the moment. And also that, again,
meaning that when you're doing it, you're much more immersed in nuances that can't possibly be described by analyzing it.
And pressures that don't apply when you're thinking about it looking back. So, for example, and also just the other things you don't think about in an office. So, for example, working with all of my colleagues, including the chief speechwriters, who had just more familiarity with President Obama's voice. So some of it's just as simple as somebody saying, he'll probably want to talk about this, 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 and this, because for them it's now second nature, it's instinct. And me saying, okay, I'll write that. So, it's sometimes you don't have to you find shortcuts around having to do all the work from the beginning every time. It would have been a lot harder if I had come to the White House with, and nobody there had been writing speeches for the president, but I was able to lean on work that my colleagues had done, and also on all the writing that President Obama had done. And that's one of the things that I kind of wanted to get across in my book is this, we think about the White House as this place with like 6 characters in it, because that's the one we see on TV or in movies. But the White House has a lot of people, and many of them, like me, were not there making history every day. I mean,
we weren't like hanging out in the Oval Office, going over every word.
No, not at all. I mean,
the President of the United States.
When I left, I probably went into the Oval Office once a month, once every 3 weeks, depending on the time period. And it wasn't like I was walking in and being like, "Oh, Mr. President, how you doing?" Like, he knew who I was, but he knew who a lot of people were. And I wanted to write a book about that side of public service, that you don't have to be the right-hand man or woman to a president to contribute to your country. I mean, you certainly can be, and that's, and those are important stories, but I think there's also worthwhile stories from all different parts of government and people at different stages in their careers. So I hope that like someone who's 22 and thinking about getting into politics feels like they could see themselves in my shoes, where it might be harder to see yourself in Ted Sorensen's shoes, sitting down and writing, a classic inauguration for a president. Well, even though that's a fascinating story.
Okay, so let's reel it back. Like you were, the other reason I'd say you had my dream youth in some sense. You were writing for The Onion. You kind of came at the White House in a weird way. Like, and you're essentially, I would call you a humorist. Even this book has a very kind of humorous sort of style. You're very self-deprecating. It's funny. You, for instance, towards the end, you talk about how at first you start complaining how the Air Force One seats only do a 45-degree decline, so you can't sleep on an 8-hour trip. Obviously, a very first world problem to complain about, and you make fun of that. So, again, writing for The Onion, which is maybe one of the funniest publications ever and currently out there, and then now you write for Funny or Die. And Obama himself has a sense of humor. Like, I don't know if you ever saw him on Jerry Seinfeld's Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. I think he was the best guest ever on that. Like, he was super funny.
Yeah, he was really funny on that.
I was surprised actually how funny he was.
I mean, I wasn't, because I had seen him. I think that was probably the closest people got to seeing, just like when people ask what was his sense of humor like, as opposed to what was he like when he was editing jokes. That's probably
It's very dry.
Yeah, very dry.
But authoritative.
Right. I think that's right. Like
he was bossing Jerry Seinfeld around.
Yeah, like he never forgot who was the president. You know what I mean? Like, there's always a pretty clear sense of like, yeah, I'm the president here. And I think that's part of that's that he knew that no one else forgot it. You know, that there's a sense of self-awareness to that you know, where he's making he was joking around with Jerry Seinfeld, but also he's like in control of the situation. He's thinking through how it is perceived even as he's doing it, which is impressive. It's not easy to do that.
Right. And he's the only guest that was ever on that show that did essentially take control of the show.
Right. Well, he's the president of the United States. That's going to happen.
But you know what? The president of the United States, we say that like, oh my God, that's the biggest person in the world. But like, the president of the United States lasts for 8 years.
Right.
For 100 years, people are going to be watching Seinfeld on TV.
So I guess that is.
And then that sounds stupid. Like, the president of the United States obviously is the most important person in the world while he's president. But still, it's not like...
No, it's not like Jerry Seinfeld's a nobody. And I will say, I mean, I grew up in apartment 5A, which is, you know, Jerry Seinfeld, also apartment 5A. So I have, you know, a great deal of respect for all things Seinfeld. But I think that there's no point when you're the president of the United States, at least in my limited experience with it, as far as I can tell, particularly, let's just say up until now, because we're living in a very different era. But there's no point where you're the president of the United States and someone in the room doesn't know it. And it changes the dynamic. I talk about in overhearing President Obama say that that's why he really enjoyed hanging out with like little babies and really little kids, because they were the only people on earth who had no idea who he was. And he didn't get, you know, that is a difference, right? Like, Jerry Seinfeld could find a room somewhere where he could walk into that room and people would be like, oh, how are you, sir? You know, but they wouldn't know who he is. And President Obama, certainly while he's president, but still, I mean, that is never going to happen. And it's a pretty strange... I remember he and Seinfeld talked about this. And I remember watching it and thinking it was pretty interesting, because they talked about their different approaches toward being famous. You know, that I think you get the sense, at least watching that video, I got the sense that President Obama kind of missed elements of being anonymous, and that Jerry Seinfeld was like, no, I love being famous. Like, this is great. I remember Jerry Seinfeld said the same thing in his Reddit AMA. You know, it was just like, yeah, being famous is great. What are you talking about?
But, you know, there was an interesting thing. There was an interesting point where they're driving around the White House driveway, and they couldn't pull out of the driveway. And not even Obama had the authority to say...
Right.
I mean, maybe he did, and he was pretending not to, but even he couldn't... Because Seinfeld asked him, you can do this, can't you? And Obama was like, no. And they couldn't drive out of the driveway because the guards were just like, nope, no, sir, keep going around.
This is a level... I mean, so first of all, yeah, I don't actually... that was scripted, but...
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, no, that was, but it was sort of playing on something somewhat real, right? Which is that Secret Service has their way of doing things, and you know, you have to think the president could override Secret Service, but most of them don't for a variety of reasons. And I don't know much more about that. That's a good question. I'm trying to think about like who I know. I don't know, when I get home to DC, I'll like have to call around and be like, do you know exactly how they, you know, how this whole process works? Because it is true that. You know, there's that sense, lots of presidents and first families have talked about this, that the White House is kind of a gilded cage in that way, that, you know, on one hand, it's the most powerful, you work hard to get there, but on the other hand, you can't leave. And I don't know exactly how they decided. It's interesting to see the differences. I mean, the security situation now looks different than it was when I was there.
But obviously, like, humor is an important part of the speechwriting process, because, again, often people will remember the jokes. Like, they'll remember... you know, Obama's sharp kind of humor, different kind of humor than other presidents. You know, I think we could sort of look at all presidents and think of their humorous moments. You know, Reagan asking his surgeon when he got shot, I hope you're a Republican. these jokes sort of stand out in entire administrations where many more important things were happening. And you came from a humorous background, writing for The Onion. So you express in the book your disenchantment with The Onion, but The Onion is an important
to be fair, what I talk about is how I was disenchanted with The Onion because it turns out I wasn't that good at writing headlines for them. So it was maybe more me than The Onion. I love The Onion.
And so talk about the connection between humor and your humor and then writing these speeches.
Well, writing jokes for a president is still joke writing for somebody else. So it is, you're thinking about what is going to be funny when they say it.
So like for instance, let's talk specifically about the Correspondents thing, where he was always known for making like funny speeches.
Right. And again,
and you were writing those.
Yeah. Well, the way we would do that, most speeches were not written in a room. It was like one person holding the pen, sending it maybe to the chief speechwriter and then to the president, and that's it. The Correspondence Centers was closer to a writer's room. So I would sit down and write jokes, but I'd also be collecting jokes from former speechwriters who were now, on the outside, but sent stuff in every spring, or professional comedy writers who we knew from, because they're big names in the comedy world, or like people I went to college with, but now they have a TV writing gig, and I'm like, hey, I want to write some jokes for the president. And so a mix of those things. And so we would get hundreds of jokes, like 600 jokes or something like that, and then cut that to about 40, and that's what we would bring to the president. So it was just a different kind of process than we would use for a more serious speech. You wouldn't have 40 or 50 iterations of the same line about infrastructure, to go back to where we're talking about originally, but you would for a joke about, I don't know, you do a joke about infrastructure, but a joke about, whatever, some comment that Mitch McConnell had made or that Ted Cruz had made, or about a self-deprecating joke for the president. And I think the fun thing about writing jokes, and then now with the book, writing about jokes, is that you see little glimpses of these more important traits and characteristics, but with the stakes being a little lower. So I talk about how with a joke, President Obama could zero in on the most important thing and kind of block out distractions. I think that's an important element of his presidency. It's one of the reasons that he accomplished a lot of the things he did accomplish.
What's an example joke?
I was talking about doing a taping where he was reading through stuff and he kept emphasizing like the second best word in the joke to emphasize. Do you know what I mean? Like the emphasis was a little off, so the jokes didn't really land. And then he did it again, and it was like he'd been practicing for a week. And it was pretty remarkable to watch that. So, not so much that he was perfect from the first time, but the fact that it took him a lot less time to go from being sort of okay to being extremely good.
Is that because he was so message driven?
No, I think
he understood the deeper meaning?
No, I think he had a very good sense, an instinct, and maybe that doesn't do it justice. I think an instinct and a habit of identifying the important thing. And realizing that was often his job, was picking out the important piece of information. So that was true in a detailed policy memo too, but that would be less fun to write about. And then some of the jokes we did kind of had not political implications, but sort of were foreshadowing in a way, that only looking back I think about. So in 2014, President Obama did a joke about how obsessed Republicans had become with Vladimir Putin. And I think that was the first time he talked about that in public. It was certainly one of the more memorable times that early he talked about it in public. And Trump didn't even make the list at the time because there were so many other Republicans obsessed with Putin. But we look back at it now and, there's some serious truth to that joke. And so there were things you were allowed to do when you're writing jokes for a president that the normal sort of standards of politics prevent you from doing the rest of the time.
So two more kind of questions, and then we'll finish this off. Get you to Tarrytown.
Yeah, that's right. Are we just going to have no context for that for listeners?
No context.
Yeah, no context. It's what the kids say these days. Got to get to Tarrytown. Okay.
One thing that's commonly said about Obama is, okay, he was a great speech giver, maybe the best, and was he able to execute as much as he was able to be so great at speech giving? And what's your opinion on that?
I think that,
And obviously execution involves a much broader world.
yeah.
But was his talent in speech giving driving more than it should have in terms of his political career?
No, I think it's, obviously he was very good at one thing. And I think he was also independent, or not independently, but not entirely relatedly good at another thing. But to some extent, you have to look at those things in isolation. That was not a very well worded way to say it. So I'm going to try this again.
My question wasn't very well worded. So,
what I mean is, I think if you look at what President Obama accomplished, I think he accomplished a remarkable amount. It doesn't mean that he accomplished everything he set out to, which would be a silly standard to judge any president by, but particularly a president living through a moment when Washington was really decaying around us. I mean, institutions that were supposed to be prioritizing the good of the country stopped doing that. And that was a serious, when in 2008, when President Obama started running, nobody said, well, there will be an economic crisis. You're going to have a Supreme Court that opens the floodgates to dark money in politics and completely upends our political system. There was a sort of a coincidence or a stroke of bad luck that we got beat so bad in 2010 in a year when gerrymandering was going to take place. And so now that locks in congressional gains for Republicans until probably 2020, maybe 2018. Anyway, so all of which is to say, I think within that context particularly, and even more broadly, just in general, there are a lot of people whose lives are better off, some people who are only alive today because Barack Obama was president. And I did try to talk about that a little in the epilogue. I didn't think I was the right person to say, was Obama a good president or not, because I'm biased. I think he was a good president, but of course I do. I do think it's worth, I remember going to the airport for year after year after year around the holidays, and I would see troops coming home. And I didn't work in foreign policy, but I got to be some tiny part of an administration that made decisions where those troops were spending Christmas with their families. And that seemed like a no-brainer, but now, this week, Trump says he's going to decertify a nuclear agreement with Iran. He's continuing to escalate things with North Korea. It turns out that winding down wars as opposed to starting them up takes real discipline and political courage. And so I think that the fact that President Obama was a good speaker shouldn't be, it seems strange to say, does the sort of actions live up to the speeches? I think that the more important question is, did he accomplish things as president? In addition, some of them were speeches, but did he have other accomplishments? And I think the answer is clearly yes. He had really sizable accomplishments, which I think we're realizing sooner than we might have otherwise, because Trump is so hell-bent on rolling them back that we realize how much, all this stuff where everyone's like, this is terrible news. The reason it's terrible news is because they were big accomplishments. And I think they'll be more enduring than Trump hopes they will, but we're realizing just how large the scope of those accomplishments is, because we're realizing how much we're losing when Trump tries to go after them.
And for you yourself, when, it's such a high stakes job, you're writing speeches for the most important person in the world. At what point were you like, oh my gosh, I can't do it anymore?
I don't think there was a point where I was like, I can't do it anymore, but I didn't want to reach that point. So I left at the beginning of 2016, and I didn't want to become the kind of person who said, I'm indispensable to the president. The country was going to be fine without me in the White House, and I didn't want to pretend that it wouldn't. And I knew the people who would be sort of applying for my job, or at least I knew many of them, and I knew they would be great at it. So I didn't feel bad in that sense. And I hit this point where the frustrating things about my job, which, everybody has things that annoy you about your job, they were looming larger, and the things I loved about my job seemed to be fading into the background. My job wasn't changing, but I'd just been there so long that you start to lose sight of some of the specialness. And I'm glad I left before I did lose sight of how special it was. I think I left, if I'd stayed an extra year, maybe I would have felt a little burned out. As it was, I think I left before that happened.
And so now you're at Funny or Die. Are you having fun?
I am having fun. It's interesting because Funny or Die originally was a job that was like sort of political, but not really. And now comedy is so much more political than it would have been if Hillary was president. And so we're kind of right back in it. But I think that's important. I'm not. I think it's important to be in it right now.
Well, where can people find you at Funny or Die? What should we watch?
The nice thing is we're putting stuff on just that's being produced and distributed by Funny or Die in general. So it's not like we have a specific sort of channel to watch. But if you look at Funny or Die, we're doing lots of cool political stuff with our team in LA. We're doing stuff for organizations in DC. So you'll find it. It's not that hard to stumble across if you're checking out what Funny or Die is doing. And so much of the comedy world today is about all the stuff that's going on in the world. You know, that intersection is happening more and more.
So, David Litt, I just want to, I actually think this is, first off, a lot of great information, a lot more information on just the history of the administration, your background. The book's excellently written. It's really funny. It's self-deprecating. It's so interesting, all the little subtleties that none of us realized during the White House years under Obama. The book's called Thanks, Obama, My Hopey, Changey White House Years by David Litt, a speechwriter's memoir. I love the fact that you got Judd Apatow, my all-time hero, as the blurb on the cover.
Oh, yeah. That was...
You also got some ex-podcast guests on the back here, including Adam Grant, one of my favorite people, and you have some good blurbs from other great guys, ranging from David Axelrod to John Mulaney. So you have comedians and speechwriters, which again shows the importance. I think the importance is not the fact that important things should be funny, but that humor often is a way to express the truth.
I think that's right.
And it's a way to help people remember. It's like an evolutionary way to help people remember. Yeah. So thanks for joining us on the podcast, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Yeah.
All right.
So what's the funniest thing? Just tell me, what's the funniest thing you wrote that the president said that you were happy he said?
Oh man, there were the thing I always go back to is he told a joke where he was like, Republicans all agree they have to do a better job reaching out to minorities. Call me self-centered, but I could think of one minority they could start with. And I love that joke just because it also, I don't know if it's the funniest thing that I wrote for him. It doesn't sound that funny when I say it, but it got at a truth about politics that we probably couldn't have expressed otherwise. So
that's really
that was fun. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for having me to Terrytown.
Next time on The James Altucher Show.
You always hear these stories, and I've never personally experienced it, where you start doing something just for your own pleasure, of course, and then it's like you turn away and you turn back, and suddenly it's this huge thing. Like, that's got to be an exciting feeling.
I originally thought I'll make some jokes on this blog. I sent a link to one friend of mine saying, check this out. And apparently he passed it around to other people. That's how it started going.
AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/advance. That's oracle.com/advance. oracle.com/advance.